Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is the first lecture in the central nervous system. The central nervous system is formed of brain and spinal cord. In this lecture, we will list the general characters of the central nervous system, divisions and subdivisions, general characters of the spinal cord section, the types of ascending tracts, and the most important point is the proprioceptive pathway. The general characters of the central nervous system include number one, it is covered by meninges. Either the brain or the spinal cord is covered by meninges. The second character, it is also covered by bone, skull for the brain, and vertebral column for the spinal cord. The third feature, it is soft jelly-like. And this is because of the absence of connective tissue, and it is one of the MCQ questions. The fourth feature, it is formed of gray matter and white matter in the fresh unstained state. And the white matter is white due to the presence of the myelin, which is mainly fatty in composition. And according to the distribution of this myelin, we have gray matter and white matter. And this is also an MCQ question. Here we have the gray matter formed of the nerve cells with no myelin. And here we have the white matter formed of the myelinated nerve fibers, either in the spinal cord or in the brain. Here we have the gray matter and the white matter. And this appearance is depending upon the distribution of the myelin, and this is one of the MCQ questions. The general characters for the spinal cord and the brain, or the CNS, now can be summarized as it is covered by meninges, bone, soft jelly-like due to the absence of connective tissue, and it consists of white matter, gray matter according to the distribution of myelin. Now, what are the divisions and the subdivisions? It is formed of the cerebrum, and this cerebrum is formed of two cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. We have the two cerebellar hemispheres. We have the brainstem formed of midbrain, pons, and the medulla. This is the subdivisions of the brain. So this is the cerebral hemispheres 2, and this is the diencephalon containing thalamus and hypothalamus. And this is the cerebellar hemisphere. We have two cerebellar hemispheres, and this is the brainstem formed of midbrain, pons, and medulla. Again, this is the cerebral hemisphere, and the diencephalon and the cerebellar hemisphere. And this is the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. Of course, this is the diencephalon containing the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And the spinal cord is formed of segments which are 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, forming a total of 31 segments. From these segments, the spinal nerves arise. So we have the cerebral hemispheres with the diencephalon, cerebellar hemispheres, the midbrain, pons, medulla. These will form the brain. And the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal will form the spinal cord. Here we have to mention very important point. The nerves present in the posterior root of the spinal nerve, these nerves are carrying in the posterior root carrying sensation, and it enters the spinal cord. Some of the nerves are described to be medial and some are described to be lateral. These medial fibers are very close to the surface of the spinal cord, and these lateral fibers are relatively away from the surface of the spinal cord. So these are called medial division of the posterior root, and this is called the lateral division of the posterior root. And this is very important in the description of the coming pathways, as some of the sensory fibers passes in the medial division and others pass in the lateral division. Now we will summarize again, or we will summarize the characters of the spinal cord. The spinal cord has a central canal here, which contains the CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. This central canal is lined by simple cuboidal to simple columnar partially ciliated to help the propulsion of the CSF. And it contains the H-shaped gray matter, which is formed of 2 posterior horns and 2 anterior horns, and additional lateral horns in the thoracic and upper 2 lumbar segments. The gray matter is formed of neurons and the naked nerve fibers together with the glial cells. The gray matter here, as you see, it is formed of the posterior horns, which contain sensory nuclei, and this is a bridge called the commissure or gray commissure, and this is the anterior horn, which contains motor nuclei. Collection of nerve cells together with each other in the gray matter is called nucleus. Then we will move to the white matter. The white matter is formed of the myelinated nerve fibers and the glial cells, and of course all you remember that this myelin is formed by oligodendroglium. The white matter can be described as posterior column from this septum, posterior median septum, and the end of the posterior horn. Lateral column between the posterior horn and anterior horn. Anterior column between the anterior median fissure and the end of the anterior horn. So these are the columns for the white matter. In the posterior column, we have only ascending tracts, long ascending tracts. In the lateral column and the anterior or ventral column, we have both ascending sensory and descending motor, long tracts in both columns. So the central canal is formed of simple cuboidal to simple columnar partially ciliated, and the cilia help the propulsion of the CSF. The gray matter is formed of 3 elements: nerve cells, unmyelinated nerve fibers, and neuroglia, and it has the 2 posterior horn, 2 anterior horn joined by the gray commissure. In the thoracic and upper lumbar, we have 2 lateral horns. The posterior horns contain sensory nuclei, the anterior horns contain motor nuclei. What is a nucleus? It is a group of nerve cells in the CNS having the same function. Actually, we will notice later on that we have 6 fixed nuclei. We have 2 sensory nuclei. Here, the substantia gelatinosa of Rolandi and nucleus proprius or main sensory nucleus. And in the gray commissure, we have anterior commissural nucleus in front of the central canal, posterior commissural nucleus behind the central canal. And in the anterior horn, we have motor nuclei, which are medial in position, and they are called anterior medial motor and posterior medial motor nuclei. These 6 nuclei are present in all the sections of the spinal cord. What about the white matter? As we have said, it is formed of 2 elements: myelinated nerve fibers and neuroglial cells, divided into posterior column, lateral column, anterior column. Anterior and lateral contain both ascending and descending, while posterior contains only sensory ascending tracts. Here we have the posterior septum and the anterior fissure. Posterior median septum, and this is anterior median fissure. We have in the spinal cord the different types of tracts that can be classified according to their length into long and short. The long tracts are also classified into ascending sensory, which are present in the 3 columns of white matter, and descending motor, which are present in the 2 columns of the white matter. While the short tracts are formed of both ascending and descending fibers, and they are short, present only in the spinal cord. As regards the ascending tracts, long ascending tracts, we have 8 ascending tracts. We have 4 ascending tracts that carry impulses to the cerebral cortex. So they lead to sensation. They are carrying sensation because the impulses will reach the cerebral cortex. So they are responsible for certain sensations that are felt. These are four, and as we have said, we have gracile, we have cuneate, they are very closely related to each other, and we have lateral spinothalamic and ventral spinothalamic, which are also related to each other. Here we have four ascending tracts, but they carry impulses that will not reach the cerebral cortex. They end in a subcortical level, so they are not responsible for carrying sensation. They are carrying impulses that will not be felt because they do not reach the cerebral cortex. These are the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar, and from the name they reach the cerebellum, and spinotectal reaching the tectum of the midbrain, and spino-olivary reaching the olivary nucleus in the medulla, inferior olivary nucleus. Here we will start with the most important point in this lecture, which is the proprioceptive pathway. What is the proprioception? It is a sense of position, sense of movement, and sense of vibration. How to test the sense of position and movement? By the test finger to nose test. Ask the patient to put his index finger on the tip of his nose from a distance. So by this way he can coordinate this movement, and he can feel the sense of position and sense of movement by adding or by performing this test. Another thing in the proprioception is the sense of vibration by using tuning fork and apply it after hitting it to a bony prominence. The patient will feel the vibration. The fine touch also is carried by the proprioception, and the fine touch means tactile localization. You can identify the exact point of touching by a pin. Tactile discrimination, you can discriminate between 2 points touching your skin. And stereognosis, you can, by feeling a subject, you can diagnose what is this subject, like a key or like a pencil or any fabric. You can diagnose it without seeing it by just touching it and from its texture. Here we have the receptors. We have muscle spindle, tendon spindle here, and the Pacinian corpus. These are receptors for the proprioception. For the fine touch, we have 3 receptors. We have Merkel disc, we have Meissner corpuscle, we have Ruffini corpuscle or Ruffini end organ. Here we have 3 receptors for the fine touch. These receptors will carry the impulses through the peripheral branches of the first order neuron. What is the first order neuron? It is present in the dorsal root ganglion, which is a spinal ganglion. In the spinal ganglion, we have 3 types of sizes: large, medium, and small. The large cells in the posterior root ganglion are responsible for carrying the proprioception and the fine touch. Their peripheral branches are thick myelinated. Their central branches enter the spinal cord through the medial division of the posterior root. And from the lower half of the body, the fibers, when enters the spinal cord, will give long ascending branches and short descending branches. We will concentrate in this lecture on the ascending tracts arising from these fibers. From the lower half of the body, the fibers will give long ascending fibers that form a tract in the posterior column called gracile tract. And as the fibers are present in the lower half, the fibers will go here to a close relation to the posterior median septum in order to give a chance for other fibers coming from higher level to collect here. So the gracile tract is present inside and very close to the posterior median septum because it is formed of fibers coming from the lower half of the body. In the upper half of the body, the long ascending fibers will occupy the cuneate tract, which is more lateral compared to the gracile tract. So the gracile tract is to the inside, cuneate tract to the outside, and the gracile is carrying the sensation from the lower half of the body, from the lower thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, while the cuneate is carrying from the upper half of the body, from the cervical and upper thoracic. So these large cells are the first order neuron in the proprioception and fine touch. Then the fibers will ascend through the spinal cord in the form of gracile and cuneate to reach the closed medulla. And in the closed medulla, they reach the second order neuron, which is the gracile nucleus for the gracile tract fibers, and cuneate nucleus for the cuneate tract fibers. So the second order neuron is the gracile and cuneate on the same side. Then the axons of the gracile and cuneate will form what is called internal arcuate fibers. Internal means that there is external. Internal arcuate means they are curved. So we have internal arcuate fibers that will cross to the other side to form together a large bundle called medial lemniscus. Why medial? Because it is very close to the middle line. And I will have later on another lemniscus which is lateral. So this is the medial lemniscus. The fibers will ascend in the medulla up to the brainstem. This crossing is called sensory decussation, and it is present in the closed medulla at the upper half of closed medulla. Then the fibers of the medial lemniscus will reach the third order neuron, which is present in the diencephalon, which is ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And then the fibers here will pass through the internal capsule in the posterior limb, then in the sensory radiation of the corona radiata, and finally will reach the sensory area in post-central gyrus area 312. Notice here this is the sensory decussation to form the medial lemniscus, and it is present in the upper half of closed medulla. Notice here the medial lemniscus very close to the middle line. Here this is the sensory area in the post-central gyrus where we have to receive the sensation of proprioception and fine touch, and this is called area 312. Again, this is the proprioceptive pathway. We have first order neuron, which is a large cells with thick myelinated fibers, central branches entering the medial division of posterior root. The fibers will give long ascending branches. The long ascending branches from the lower half of the body will form the gracile. The long ascending branches from the lower half of the body, from the upper half of the body, is called cuneate tract. And then the second order neuron is the gracile and cuneate on the same side. And then they give the internal arcuate fibers, sensory decussation, medial lemniscus, and then the third order neuron on the opposite side, which is present in the diencephalon, ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and then finally we reach the sensory area. Here we will see now this animation for the proprioceptive and fine touch pathway. We have the receptors, and then we have the first order neuron, and it is the large cells with the thick myelinated, and then we have the second order neuron, which is the gracile and cuneate nuclei, sensory decussation, and the medial lemniscus. And then we have the third order neuron, the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, posterior limb, corona radiata sensory radiation, post-central gyrus 312. For the fine touch, the receptors are the, as we will complete again, we will again repeat the receptors. The receptors for the proprioception are the muscle spindle, tendon spindle, Pacinian corpuscle. For the fine touch, Meissner, Raffini, and Merkel. The first order neuron, the large cells in the spinal ganglia with thick myelinated, and the fibers will enter through the medial division. The branches from the lower half will form the gracile tract on the same side. From the upper half will form the cuneate on the same side. cuneate and gracile tracts end in the gracile and cuneate nuclei on the same side. Second is the gracile and cuneate nuclei form the internal arcuate fibers, cross in the sensory decussation, and form the medial lemniscus. The third is the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and the fibers will pass through the sensory radiation and the posterior limb of the internal capsule, in the sensory area of the postcentral gyrus area 312. Then we have the question in this part. You may have a question dealing with the proprioceptive pathway from the body with fine touch, and it is a direct question, or description of gracile, cuneate, or the medial lemniscus. The proprioceptive pathway, we will recall all what we have said as regards the receptors, the first order neuron, the second order neuron, the third order neuron. But as regards the gracile and cuneate, you will describe the gracile or the cuneate as in the form of the following points: definition, origin, course, termination, and function. This is a table that can collect all the data about both tracts. As regards the definition, both are long ascending sensory tract. As regards the origin, larger cells in the posterior root ganglia that receive the sensations of proprioception and fine touch through the thick myelinated fibers and give the central branches through the medial division. As regards the course, both are present in the posterior column of white matter, but the gracile, it is present in all the levels of the spinal cord because it starts from low down and should complete its journey. But the cuneate is present only in the cervical and upper thoracic levels. As regards the termination, the ipsilateral gracile nucleus enclosed medulla, while this ipsilateral cuneate nucleus enclosed medulla. As a function, the same function, but here from the lower ipsilateral half of the body, sacral, lumbar, lower thoracic, and here proprioception and fine touch from the upper ipsilateral half of the body, from cervical and upper thoracic. What is a lemniscus? The meniscus is described by being a bundle of what? Of secondary sensory fibers. What is the meaning of secondary? Because it is a second order neuron in a sensory pathway. So it is secondary sensory fibers present where? In the brain stem. ايه هو البرين stem? midbrain, pons and medulla. Terminate where? It terminates in the diencephalon, in special or specific nuclei. So the lemniscus is a very important definition, and you should remember that we have 4 lemnisci. The first one was described in this lecture, which is the medial lemniscus, but we have an additional 3, which are the spinal lemniscus, lateral lemniscus, and trigeminal lemniscus. This is the medial lemniscus. If you are asked to describe the medial lemniscus, first you will have to define it. It is an ascending sensory, not tract, it is more than tract, it is ascending sensory bundle, more than tract because it is huge number of fibers coming from these 2 nuclei. So it is an ascending sensory bundle. The origin from the gracile and cuneate nuclei on the opposite side. The course, it passes in the brain stem, midbrain, pons and medulla. And the termination is in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus here, and the function, it carries the proprioception, fine touch from the opposite half of the body because it is a second order neuron, and the second order neuron is always crossing, so it carries the sensation from the opposite side of the body. Here, a very important point: the cerebellum should have an information about proprioception. It takes this information from the spinal cord through 5 spies, 5 ways. The first way is this one. Here we have what? We have the gracile and cuneate nuclei, which have received the gracile and cuneate tract carrying the proprioception fine touch from the same side of the body. These nuclei, as we have said before, they send internal arcuate fibers that will form the medial lemniscus and ascend upwards to give you the sense of proprioception and fine touch. But in addition to the internal arcuate fibers, which are not drawn here. We have external arcuate fibers. The external are divided into two types. We have posterior external arcuate fibers with the green color, anterior external arcuate fibers with this purple color. The posterior will pass directly through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to reach the cerebellum to give the cerebellum information about proprioception so that you can have a coordinated movement and you keep your balance by the function of the cerebellum. But the anterior external arcuate fibers will pass to the other side, relay in arcuate nucleus, and then will enter the cerebellum on the other side through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we have here the nuclei of the other side here, forming the anterior external arcuate fibers that will pass to the other side, relay in arcuate nucleus, and then ascend through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, forming anterior, because they occupy an anterior location, forming anterior external arcuate fibers. Here we can see this movement. We have here the posterior external arcuate fibers. The impulse will pass directly through it to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, while the fibers coming from the other side here, which are anterior external arcuate fibers, will cross to the other side and relay in the arcuate and pass through the anterior part of the inferior cerebellar peduncle on the other side. So the posterior are direct and the anterior are crossed. The posterior are coming from the same side, while the anterior are coming from the opposite side. Both of them will give information about proprioception to the cerebellum. This is the picture in your book. Here we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, we have the posterior external arcuate fibers coming directly from the same sided gracile and cuneate nuclei, and this is the anterior external arcuate fibers coming from the opposite gracile and cuneate nuclei, and after crossing or relay in the arcuate nucleus will pass through the anterior part of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Clinical point or clinical significance, which is important in the MCQ question: any lesion in gracile or cuneate will form what? Loss of sense of position, movement, vibration, fine touch in what? In the same limb, because gracile and cuneate tracts are belonging to the first order neuron, so that they are on the same side. They are not second order neuron. So the lesion will have an effect on the same limb, but below the level of the lesion, of course, because above the level of the lesion, the fibers are intact. Here you can test for the integrity of this proprioception from the spinal cord by asking your patient to close her eyes, because the eyes send impulse to the cerebellum to help to keep your balance. But if you close your eyes and the proprioception is damaged in the spinal cord, you will lose your balance. So we ask the patient to close the eyes and to make a short distance of walking. If the patient is not keeping his balance, this means that there is a lesion in the gracile, mainly gracile, of course, because this is a lower limb, lesion in the gracile that prevent the cerebellum to reach out to learn anything about proprioception in the lower limb and cannot keep the balance. Here the eyes are closed, so no impulse for the cerebellum to help it. So the patient, as we will see here, this is a patient with a lesion in the gracile tract, and here with opening his eyes he can walk somewhat normally, but when he closes his eyes he is swinging, because now the cerebellum is not aided by the vision, and the gracile is not working perfectly, so he is swinging. Thank you very much.